level of our social lives if it's going to ramify outward into society at large and into our whole vision of nature. But let me take it further. We must reconstitute community as a heroic act of consciousness. As a calling, we must reconstitute community. We must begin not only to resist the attempt to corrode community, and nothing could be more corrosive at times than a shopping mall in the neighborhood, or a highway going through a neighborhood or a city. We must begin to recover again amongst ourselves that solidarity, whether it means opening up gardens in our community so that people can work together and share and compare their vegetables and fruits. I've seen that actually happen in the worst ghetto areas in the world, in the Lower East Side of New York, where people associated with the Institute for Social Ecology that I was involved in founding. It is not tied in with Goddard College, by the way. It's a totally autonomous institution now in Vermont. Went down to the Lower East Side where you have nothing but these gutted out buildings, you know. Gangs, heroin, addiction of every kind, prostitution, theft, where there was every reason to feel that your life was being placed in peril if you just went out after curfew, and the curfew was self-imposed, that was dark. The moment the sun went down, people put themselves in the prisons of their own apartments, and the streets were let loose to whatever could happen. And anything could happen at that time. And some of our students who completed our courses went down there and working with us began to clear away the debris with members of the community, and began to try to rehabilitate some of the buildings that had been abandoned. They were totally gutted out. And they began to plant gardens in New York City. These were Spanish-speaking people, Puerto Ricans. And then a strange catalytic action began to occur. In the course of the gardening process, people at first would sit around, scratch their heads, walk around and wonder what's going on here, because everything is a con, a game, you know, down on the Lower East Side. When you deal in dope or stolen cars or automobile parts or jewelry or stolen TV sets, what does this mean? What is the price tag? But bit by bit they began to find kids getting involved, gangs that were even rivals, working together through the sheer patient catalysis of mediation, through the sheer patient catalysis of bringing people together, of discussing what could be done with the neighborhood. They began to clear away the debris. They turned it into a hill so that the kids can play on it. And then afterward they began to pick up soil, because New York is always building, you understand, and that means it removes its topsoil, leaving behind clay. And they began to put it in trucks, and they began to lay it out in French-intensive gardens. Soon, older people who had been gardening in Puerto Rico and had some background in it began to come down, were curious, and wanted to show what they knew. That's the way people are. They had been sitting, looking out of their windows day in and day out, and watching, in the patient, almost painstaking way of elderly people who are no longer very mobile. They came down, and they began to say, do it this way, not that way, remembering from Puerto Rico and from their village life. And the elders produced a certain, how shall I put it, resonance in the younger people, because the elders were yet to be respected in these Latin families, you see. So younger people began to watch. Before long, they began to divide up these French-intensive plots. They began to grow. Before long, more and more people in the community were involved. And finally, they began to grow their cabbages and carrots, planting tomatoes. They weren't becoming self-sufficient, obviously not. You can't grow enough, and God knows what's in that soil in any case as a result of the heavy metals that come down in the way of pollution in New York. But still. And then they began to take a pride in what they had, and they began to compare. And before long, a neighborhood solidarity was gradually developed that had not existed before. A neighborhood built on fear. A neighborhood initially of people coming from village life, who were suddenly thrown into the anonymous world of the city, began to compare vegetables, and finally began to integrate and work together, and began to protect this turf. And soon they put a fence around it in case there were any gangs or just ordinary juveniles who were out, to spoil everything is a form of protest. To despoil something in New York is a form of protest. It's to say, I am here. This badge was smashed by this gang to prove that we exist. Police force or no police force, mayor or no mayor, we exist. This window pane was smashed to assert that I exist. That attempt at self-identification through nihilism. And that fence was not even touched. It was respected. It was respected. And before long, an amazingly integrated and intersubjective and intercommunicative world was created around that one garden. That was the miracle of the garden. Not that it grew the food, not that it made them self-sufficient, but that it got them involved. In the case of the elderly people, redolent of their earlier lives in the villages in the Caribbean. In the case of younger people, exploratory, amazed at the miracle of growth itself. In the case of still others, a desire to develop some sense of affinity, and using that as the medium for doing so, a community was formed. And before long, they began to establish in other burnt-out areas, removing the debris, a Plaza del Pueblo, a plaza of the people. And they began to reenact again old scenes from the villages, music, dances, songs, and their own unique culture, which they call New Rican, because they're neither accepted in New York as Puerto Rican, as anything but Puerto Rican, and they're not accepted in Puerto Rico as anything but Americans. So they decided to invent their own ethnic designation as New Rican, composing their own songs in a patois of English-Spanish, and their own music combining both rock and Caribbean beats. And finally, they began to open their own cafe, etc., etc., etc. Of course, Mayor Koch, King Koch, as we like to call him, intervened. And most importantly, gentrification began to occur. The yuppies began to come in. And they began to buy up the buildings. They began to improve them. The rentals began to go up. And these people are now in retreat, so they have a real problem. But I simply want to show you the catalysis of community based around an ecological endeavor. And that is organic gardening, French-intensive gardening in New York City. And putting up at the same time solar energy panels on East 11th Street. And putting up a windmill which generated no real electric power, but was an act of defiance against that huge utility in the backdrop called Consolidated Edison. Do you know that Consolidated Edison actually brought them to court because they were generating a small quantity of electricity since it invaded their monopoly of New York City's electricity, and they won. The windmillers won. And it was put on the front page of the New York Times. Con Edison loses court battle to windmill. But this was a sense of triumph, and it was a sense of identification. They began to wear sweatshirts, Lower Sider, abbreviating the English with a Spanish ring to it, not Lower East Side, Lower Sider, Loisada, Lower Sider. And they formed bands and everything like that. There are other forces that stand in their way. The recovery of community thus becomes, and particularly in this ecological sense that I've tried to portray, and the recovery of the traditions of community thus become an imperative basis for creating, above all, that spirit of defiance and that spirit and individuation that yields social change. We must, in this respect, be imaginative. We must recognize the enormous integration of our ways of dealing with each other on the most elemental level of parental and sexual association, to those levels of education based on an active politics and an active citizenry that is empowered, to those forms of community association that will partly remove us from the system and create some distance from the system, of corporate gigantism and state centralization, so that these communities once again can come together and develop a new kind of politics to boot. And here I wish to push my own point of view.